Okay, my name is Lawrence McGlynn, and you are listening to the award-winning Philadelphia Hall Monitor here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHMWPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Laura Little, professor of law at Temple University and proprietor of Forum.com, Forhum, and she is an expert on the First Amendment. And I'd like to bring in Denise Clay Murray and Vanessa Maria Graber. Now,
Hi.
Denise, oh, hello, everybody. Say hello, everybody.
Hi. Hello, everybody.
There you go.
Hello.
Now, Denise, you might be wondering, why do we have a First Amendment expert on the program tonight? Why would we do that?
Well, because the First Amendment has been in the news a lot this week. Specifically, Jimmy Kimmel, the host of Jimmy Kimmel Live on ABC, was taken off the air by ABC because of some comments that he had allegedly made about the death of Charlie Kirk, that, as it turned out, weren't comments about the death of Charlie Kirk at all. They were something about the president and about the MAGA movement that folks just got upset about and decided that he needed to be off the air. Another reason we're probably talking a lot about the First Amendment is because while this was one of the more high-profile examples of the White House throwing its weight around and causing people issues in terms of being able to do their jobs as media people, there have been a lot of instances where the First Amendment has been under attack. Right now, there are several foreign journalists that are either being denied visas or are being targeted by ICE for their work. You also have Karen Attiah, the lone Black columnist left at the Washington Post. Everybody else had gotten up and left because they kind of saw the handwriting on the wall, who was fired from her job for a column she wrote that included many of Charlie Kirk's own words. And you also had a lot of instances where people would talk about why they weren't necessarily, going to go to Kirk's memorial service from him being shot. Notice I did not say assassinated. That they were, taken away from their media platforms and fired and different things. So the First Amendment in this particular case, and why it made sense for us to discuss it, is because a lot of folks in our current government don't seem to understand that under the First Amendment, they cannot tell you what you are and aren't allowed to say, because the First Amendment is very clear. Congress will make no law restricting freedom of speech or press. And, sometimes you have to re-explain that to people in this country, especially when they don't seem to want to understand that concept.
And Vanessa, this is something you deal with all the time. What is going on here, and how should we be looking at this?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. Yes, it has been more amplified in the press lately. However, as we know, I think a lot of this came to a head last year when students began protesting on their campuses in support of Palestine. We saw students get arrested, get suspended, mainly because of their speech on this issue. Then we started to see students who were writing about this, like Ramisa Turk, who wrote about this in her student newspaper, get jailed and detained in an immigrant detention center. Mahmoud Khalid, another student who is now being ordered deported, he spent months in federal detention as well for his speech. And we've seen Mario Guevara, an immigrant journalist who has been detained for more than 100 days in a federal detention center with no real charges. Charges were brought against him for simply recording a protest. Those charges were dismissed, and he was ordered released on bond, but he is still being incarcerated. More recently, we've seen a number of journalists and employees be fired because of what they wrote about Charlie Kirk. We saw broadcast media get tear gassed in Chicago for recording a protest outside an immigrant detention center that was caught live while they were on the air. And many, many more instances of, press freedom and freedom of speech and the freedom to assemble, which all three of those things, and in addition to the freedom to practice your own religion, are enshrined in the First Amendment. And one thing about the First Amendment that I constantly have to clarify for people is that there's no free speech in someone's home, right? So if you say something offensive and in someone's home, they have the right to kick you out. Now, free speech is really about government censorship. And so I actually want to clarify something that Denise said, which is, people were upset about Jimmy Kimmel, but people have been upset about a lot of his content for the entire time he's been on the air. And when he went on the air last night, he said, hey, listen, I've been getting hate mail and violent threats for a long time. Nothing has ever happened. That's never changed my relationship with ABC and Disney. It wasn't until FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr made threats to ABC and Disney that the relationship changed, and that resulted in his suspension. And this is a clear example of a First Amendment violation where FCC, right, and the FCC chair, who is an agent of the government, is threatening to censor hundreds of broadcast affiliate stations simply because of the speech that they aired that they disagreed with. This is where we have a government overreach. And this is why so many legal scholars and people at stations just like ours are concerned, right? This show airs right now on WPPM 106.5 FM. We have a license to operate. And part of the beauty of having this license is the ability to have discussions like this without fear of censorship. There are thousands of stations just like ours all across the United States, both in public media, community media, and commercial stations. Now, there's a list of rules that we have to follow. Obviously, we don't have free speech here in the sense that we can't curse on the air. We can't slander or libel anybody. We can't sell products because we have a non-commercial license. But by and large, we have the freedom to create and direct our own editorial content without fear of government interference. And so that has really changed this year because both Brendan Carr, the FCC commissioner, and President Trump have made a number of threats indicating that they would be revoking licenses and that they would find it illegal for people to be airing content over the air of content that they don't like, they don't agree with. This is where we have the problem. And so because we have a platform online and a newsletter, we have a lot of freedom, right, as a worker-owned cooperative to say and do what we want. That is the beauty of being independent media and owning our media platform outright. However, when it comes to broadcasting live on the air like we are right now, that's where we have a concern, right? Because there is a looming threat that both President Trump and FCC Commissioner Carr will then start to look at stations like ours who are on the Pacifica Network and others like, NPR and PBS stations that are under an active investigation right now, again, because of content that they did not agree with. In fact, they defunded the Corporation for Public Broadcasting because of content they did not agree with. And so, if you are a quote unquote broadcaster, there is a real fear that's present and has a chilling effect on our journalism. And secondly, not only do people fear, what the FCC might do, but if you work for a large media network like Disney, like Sinclair, like Nexstar, there is a fear of corporate censorship, right? Capitulating to sponsors, to donors, to special interests, and censoring the content of broadcasters and journalists. And so we're in the bad place, as they say right now. And of course, journalists have always gotten in trouble for things that they wrote, no matter what administration has been in power. But now we're seeing an overreach and a capitulation from corporate media that we haven't seen since the days of 9/11, where there was a lot of scrutiny about how people talked about the 9/11 attacks and President Bush's choice to invade Iraq and Afghanistan.
And it's interesting that you mentioned corporate media censorship, because what was happening with corporations played a lot into this. For example, CBS's decision to get rid of the Late Show with Stephen Colbert, in fact, to get rid of the concept of a late show period on CBS, was indirectly tied to a fear of Paramount not being able to merge with Skyfall, because the FCC had to approve it. And they practiced, preemptive obedience by saying, okay, we'll get rid of this thing that we think is making you mad, and so you can let us have our merger. And currently, Nexstar, which is one of the owners of like roughly 20% of the local television stations in the country, including some ABC affiliates, in fact, a lot of ABC affiliates, wants to merge with Warner Productions, Warner Brothers. And there's that fear of not being able to do that has come up. And then you have Disney, who through ESPN has just purchased the NFL network, and but that deal isn't completely approved by the FCC yet. So you have a lot of corporate stuff that's going on behind the scenes that's directly impacting free speech, because they don't want to make anybody angry, so they can't do the mergers they want to do. So they're going to their problem children, as it were, and getting them out of the way, or silencing them, or attempting to silence them. But what made the fact that Kimmel came back on last night so interesting is that Disney has always had a reputation for playing hardball with anyone and everyone. They are notorious for it. There have been times where, like, YouTube TV and Comcast and other places that carry Disney content, either as ESPN or ABC, have not had that access to that content because they didn't want to pay what Disney wanted them to pay to carry it, and Disney played hardball until these companies relented. What we're finding out now is all of the local stations, mostly Sinclair stations and Nexstar stations, that are deciding not to carry Jimmy Kimmel Live until he does some sort of penance, which in their case includes a donation to Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk's nonprofit. They're saying, we're not going to carry this because we don't think you have disciplined him enough. But what they're not counting on is the fact that Disney has college football, NFL football, and a whole bunch of other sports on ESPN that they're holding over their heads. And Disney hasn't pulled that trigger yet. But the word I'm hearing is that, okay, we're going to let you not carry this piece of programming that you are mandated to carry under your agreement with us. But if you keep doing it more than a week or two, we're going to start playing hardball. And almost every time that someone has tried to play hardball with the mouse, which is what people nickname Disney, they tend to lose. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all works out.
Yeah, I just want to clarify one thing. Nexstar Media Group is has agreed to a definitive merger with Tegna. It's not Warner Brothers, but
I knew
Tegna.
one of them had Warner Brothers. I can't remember which one.
Yeah, and you bring up an important point because these mergers are a really big reason why they're continuing to capitulate and try to appease Brendan Carr at the FCC, because the FCC has to approve these mergers. And it's the reason why CBS and Paramount also reprimanded 60 Minutes and made a lot of changes. They essentially took over the program, which resulted in many of the producers and journalists leaving the show. And that was because they were getting ready to merge with, I think it was Skydance Media. And so these mergers are playing a really big part in the decision making around whether or not to take Jimmy Kimmel off the air. Now, I think it's important to note that there were thousands of phone calls that were made to ABC affiliates across the country, and there were protests in New York and Los Angeles, and I think that weighed in too. I asked a friend who works at 6ABC here locally if they had received any calls, or, I kind of asked for the scoop, and he said that yes, that they were flooded with calls this week from people upset about the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel.
But what was even more important than that, and it goes back to my friends, the Wu-Tang Clan, who told us cash rules everything around me, even more so than people calling in and saying, we don't like this, we want you to bring him back on, stop suppressing free speech. You had thousands of people who decided that they didn't want Hulu, Disney Plus, or ESPN anymore. And they were canceling their subscriptions and saying, this is why I'm canceling my subscription. They're basically saying, I don't necessarily need to watch The Bear, or to watch the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or to watch Abbott Elementary reruns, because, or I don't need to pay for these things because you're using my money to suppress free speech, and I'm not down with that. Of course, Disney has since raised the price on these things. Now, if you did want to resubscribe, the price has gone up like a couple of bucks, but Disney's stock price took like a $4 billion hit. And, again, cash rules everything around us. And because of that, folks were like, we need to rethink this.
So what is at the heart of this is, again, the First Amendment. And if you're looking around, you'll see a lot of people with different opinions as to what the First Amendment means. And so we decided, well, let's go to somebody who actually understands this and has studied this and is a lawyer. So we spoke with Professor Laura Little from Temple University, and she also is the proprietor of forum.com, spelled Forhum. And this website looks at the First Amendment and comedy and how those two things fit together, which is kind of right on the nose for what we've been talking about here. So this is our interview with Professor Laura Little. So Professor Little, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So the first thing I'd like to ask you about, and so this is we'll start right from the beginning, I think. What is the First Amendment to the Constitution?
It is the first of the Bill of Rights, which were added out onto the Constitution a few years after the body of the Constitution was ratified. I believe that it was put first because it was deemed by the framers to be the most important individual right. That is, right of an individual against an oppressive government. It has basically two components. One component is freedom of communication, freedom of expression. And then it has two religion clauses, freedom of religion and a prohibition against the meshing of church and state. I understand that it's probably most on people's minds these days to focus on freedom of communication. But I'll just note that it's always been a bit of a puzzle why, in fact, the framers decided to put the two together, that is, communication and religion. And the thought was both appealed to freedom of conscience and were therefore connected in that way.
Are there limitations on the communications aspect of the First Amendment?
Not if you take the words on their own face. The First Amendment says no, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of the peace and freedom of the press, freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So that suggests it's absolute. But through history, qualifications have been read into that amendment, that is, protecting different types of interests that are deemed more important than freedom of communication at a given time.
What are some examples of that?
Well, one example is a breach of the peace where what is taking place is a threat of immediate harm to individuals. That is, if in fact you have an incitement of violence and that violence is deemed to be imminent and the situation is such that violence will soon follow, that is an exception to the freedom of communication. Another example would be obscenity. Obscenity is deemed to be a category of unprotected speech.
Okay. So the example du jour of free speech we're talking about right now is the Jimmy Kimmel situation. Now, as we are recording this on a Tuesday, this will air Wednesday evening. Jimmy Kimmel's program will be back on the air tonight. However, the week that he has been off the air, and I'm going to editorialize just a little bit here. I'm not an attorney. I don't know anything. That's why I do this. But it seemed to me like this was a First Amendment violation because there was clear pressure brought to bear by the Federal Communications Commission. That's how I'm looking at it. And I could be wrong. How do you see this case as in the view of the communications aspect of the First Amendment?
So each of the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, presumably does not apply unless you have government engaging in some kind of action. It's called state action, even if it's the federal government. So you are correct in that you're suggesting that we need to evaluate whether there's state action in the Jimmy Kimmel situation. In my experience, the Supreme Court in the past has been not so rigid in applying a state action requirement in some context with the First Amendment. That is, private conduct may actually make out the state action requirement under certain circumstances. What we have, so we just start with that presumption that, in fact, there may be some looseness in the joints in terms of how much the government needs to be involved for there to be a First Amendment violation. What appears to have happened with respect to Jimmy Kimmel was people were upset about what he said and when he said it. It came to the attention of the FCC chair. And at the time, there was a potential merger that was going to become in front of the FCC for approval so that the corporate entities, the structures that ultimately controlled Jimmy Kimmel, were threatened in potentially not getting what they want. And what the FCC chair suggested was that if, in fact, Jimmy Kimmel continued on the air, that corporate structure would be also threatened in some way. So the influence of government was indirect. It was for pulling the strings of the corporate world to influence whether Jimmy Kimmel could have a platform for communications, for expressing particular points of view.
So one of the arguments that I've heard from the people who support the actions taken is that Jimmy Kimmel did not lose his First Amendment right. He can still say whatever he wants, but his employers made a decision. Is there logic to that argument, or does the First Amendment prohibit coercion by the government?
There have been cases in which the government is trying to coerce certain types of speech where there's been some kind of private actor that is intervening. So it's that reasoning that it's not the government that's making the decision here, it has no influence, is simplistic in terms of exactly how the strings of power have been put in place. Because ultimately, there's a problem for the corporate sponsors that the FCC is not happy, and that in fact they might not get what they want in other contexts. There's also statements that the FCC, these broadcast entities, which actually provide a forum for getting certain points of view to a very large collection of people, that requires a certificate from the FCC, and those could be pulled. And that is a threat by a governmental entity.
So there's another example that I feel like isn't getting the same coverage right now, but it's just as bad, if not worse. And that's what's happening at the Defense Department. They are now requiring credentialed journalists at the military headquarters to sign a pledge to refrain from reporting information that has not been authorized for release, including unclassified information. So a press that is required to sign a government pledge regarding reporting, well, it doesn't seem like a press at all to me. Does this also rise to the level of a violation of the First Amendment? And if so, what are the legal options for people who are caught in this situation?
It certainly implicates the First Amendment. I think sometimes it's easy to, or it's helpful to step back and to think about what the First Amendment is about. The First Amendment is in place not for speech that we like, not for speech we embrace. We don't need a protection for that, right? We want to hear that. Likewise for the government, right? They want to hear certain points of view. They don't need to be controlled in that regard. What the First Amendment is in place for the purpose of is protecting speech we as a public, the government as an entity, does not like. That is, there needs to be protections against particular entities. And one of the first impetus behind the First Amendment was concern with censorship of the press. And one of the very, very stringent doctrines of the First Amendment is that we cannot restrain speech from happening, and government cannot restrain speech from being expressed except in extraordinary circumstances, such as the location of troop ships in a time of war. So that something that looks like a prior restraint on speech sends up flares in terms of a First Amendment violation. And the fact that it's the Department of War, I guess it's now called, that is requiring this kind of pre-clearance, basically, is a real problem under first the history and case law interpreting the First Amendment, because in fact it's specifically influencing what the press can say. If in fact we're talking about the Department of War trying to restrain the conveyance of highly classified information, that's a totally different matter. But as I understand it, this loyalty oath pertains both to unclassified and classified information. And because it's unclassified that's covered, there's no like sort of countervailing concept or concern that would actually merit muzzling the press. So I guess I have a couple points to make about this. And one is that it's targeting the press. And the press is deemed to be precious to our society because the press is, in fact, the mouthpiece in which news is actually broadcast to the to the public. And second, the loyalty oath is acting as a sort of a gag to the press that if they want to continue to do their job and get information out, they have to honor this particular type of censorship, which is in fact invalid under the First Amendment.
All right, I'd like to bring in Denise Clay Murray here on Philadelphia Hall Monitor.
Oh, I was on mute. I'm sorry. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Little. We really appreciate it. My question regarding the First Amendment, what do people get wrong about it? Because, we talk a little bit about what it is, but what do people get wrong when talking about it or when trying to access it?
I think that one of the primary problems that people have is the concept of state action. That is, with all of the Bill of Rights, really they only apply technically if government is trying to shut you up. Government is gagging you and censoring you. So that you can't just say to your friends, I can say whatever I want. You can't shut me up. That's my First Amendment right. And your friend is not any sort of entity that's connected to government, then you don't necessarily have a First Amendment problem, unless you can sort of trace what your friend is doing to some sort of governmental threat. I would say that's the primary mistake that I hear.
Okay. Now, it's interesting that you said that. Prior to my becoming a member of the Hall Monitor crew, I covered organized hate groups in Berks County. And because of that, let's just say I got some language thrown at me that I had to remember I was a professional and not respond to.
Mm-hmm.
We talk a lot about hate speech and what the concept of hate speech is, and, whether or not, the government can, clamp down on hate speech. Can you talk about hate speech within the First Amendment and why it's kind of, while it's kind of hard to, I guess, for want of a better way to put it, police?
I'm glad you brought that up because I would say that's the second most error that people make in understanding the scope of the First Amendment. And that is the First Amendment, whether we like it or not, don't shoot the messenger here, right? The First Amendment protects hate speech. As sort of despicable as it may be, it's considered to express a point of view. It's often about something that's going on in society that may implicate politics, ideas. And the notion is in the United States that anything that represents an idea that's being expressed should not be censored, should not be prohibited. So the general principle is that hate speech is constitutionally protected. We are very unusual as regards the rest of the world, by the way, on that position. And people think that, in fact, we're out of our minds for protecting hate speech, but that is, in fact, the law of the United States. If the hate speech crosses a line to put someone in immediate threat of bodily injury or death, then, in fact, it's not constitutionally protected. But absent that kind of true threat, it is the ideas that are being expressed through hate speech are protected by the First Amendment.
Now, there have been several other cases involving like ABC getting sued by Donald Trump and settling a lawsuit over George Stephanopoulos saying that, saying something about Trump's lawsuit against E. Jean Carroll, or 60 Minutes being sued over, editing a piece on Kamala Harris. When you look at stuff like New York Times versus Sullivan and different things, you see, why did these people settle? when the First Amendment and by extension the law is clearly on their side. And then you take into consideration all of the mergers and different things of media companies that are going on in the FCC's control of that. Should we be looking at both of these things together? Because I can't help but think that there's a lot of corporate media stuff that's trying to impede on First Amendment rights.
So yeah, I think you probably, by putting those two things together, right, is that the government has a lot of power with respect to different types of business decisions and business benefits that the media companies are concerned about. And you're putting that together with the fact that the media companies are caving to demands for retribution with respect to speech that would be protected speech. And I think the answer, I can't read the minds of the executives that are in fact agreeing to settle for these huge amount of money. But my guess is that in fact they are in fear that they'll lose their broadcast license, that in fact their mergers won't be able to go through, and the like. The government has a huge amount of power over them in terms of their desires of how they're going to conduct their business. And it's for that reason that they decide to pay a settlement for what looks like is a completely meritless suit.
Now, I just have one last question. Is the free speech guarantee in the First Amendment truly equal for everyone? Because I can't help but notice that while Jimmy Kimmel is coming back on the air, Karen Attiah of the Washington Post, for doing her job, no longer has one. So is the First Amendment equal for everybody? Can everybody use it equally?
In theory, it is, right? In theory, it does protect one person the same as it protects another person. Now, I think that if you're a member of the press, that in fact there's this historical preference for ensuring a free press, but that doesn't explain the differential treatment that you just described. In terms of trying to explain those differences, a lot of it may have to do with corporate clout and somehow a connection with the big wheels of power.
Okay.
And a decision by an employer whether to go to bat for you or not.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, our co-host, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
All right, thank you,
you.
Denise. And Professor Little, before we let you go, I have one more question that I forgot to ask in the beginning. What happens if somebody lies? Whether it's somebody in the news or they have a platform, does the First Amendment cover that?
So one hears a lot of inconsistencies in the law when it comes to untruths. I can tell you that the Supreme Court has often said that a false idea or a false statement should not be censored, we should not prevent it from entering the marketplace of ideas, because if we stifle it, then it's still going to be possibly believed by the person that wanted to express it. And there's no opportunity to refute it. So this is all based on an idea of a marketplace of ideas. But then you also find some statements in cases that suggest false speech is a lesser quality speech, that in fact much harm is done by false speech. And there are in fact settled instances where false speech can be prohibited, where you have that threat of violence, but it has to be that immediate threat of violence. There was a case several years ago based on a federal statute known as the Stolen Valor Act, which made it a crime to, in fact, pretend as though you've received a military honor, which you did not. And the Supreme, so basically you're lying, right? You're lying that you received a Purple Heart when you didn't receive a Purple Heart. And the Supreme Court said that that type of untruth is constitutionally protected because, again, it allows the untruth to get expressed and to be refuted by those that say they have the truth.
All right. Professor Little, where can people find your work?
I have it on the internet in a lot of places. That is an SSRN. If you Google me, you can see a list of my work. Temple Law School has a list of my work if you go to the Temple Law School website.
All right. Well, Professor Laura Little, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
And so I think what we saw there, and the law is not always a black and white thing. That's one of the things that you learn covering court cases and things, and Denise can speak to that better than any of us. But it seemed to me there that everything we asked about and everything we talked about suggested that what the government was doing and is continuing to do at different levels is illegal and theoretically should result in more lawsuits and rights being returned to people if they continue down this path.
I think we're going to see efforts, probably by Democrats, to hold congressional hearings about this. And I also think that there will be calls for FCC Chair and Commissioner Carr to resign or be removed. I don't know that those efforts will be effective, but certainly it is Congress's role to oversee the federal agencies. And I think right now people have a lot of questions about the manner in which FCC Commissioner Carr, who's also the chair, has been talking about this on podcasts, ironically. And specifically something that he said was, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And if you caught Jimmy Kimmel's show last night, they spoofed that by having Robert De Niro guest star as the new FCC chair, acting like a mob boss. And so I think that is the behavior that is really concerning. I think it is the commissioner's, any FCC commissioner's role to have questions about content. However, when you start to threaten stations like that, that's where we start to think about, what are the legalities of making statements like that. And just one thing I want to add to Professor Little's answer to your question about lying on the air. Lying under the First Amendment. So if you are a content creator on a social media platform, or if you're a newspaper, there's different implications for, whether or not, you lie or falsify the news or spread disinformation. But largely there's not government interference. However, if you are a broadcast station, you do have to follow the FCC's rules on broadcast news distortion, which is to say that you can't knowingly falsify the news. And their policy states that news distortion must involve a significant event and not merely a minor or incidental aspect of the news report. This is the thing that was being challenged by the Trump administration during the 60 Minutes interview with presidential candidate Kamala Harris. And so most people who understand the editing process saw that as just making edits and not actually falsifying or distorting the news. And also, very rarely has a license been revoked or not renewed or signed for broadcast news distortion. And so I think, even though they have that rule, there's very little enforcement of that. And when you look for the criteria, you will not find it like in the FCC rules. What you will find it is in cases that have come before a judge. And there is a very strict criteria for proving a news distortion case. So you have to prove that a broadcast station knowingly falsified the news, did it recklessly, right, with the intention to harm, with malice, and that they have a pattern of behavior of doing it. So not just a one-off incident. And so I think when it comes to affiliates like Fox News and the Dominion voting machines case, that would have been a perfect example of an instance where a member of the public could have brought a complaint against Fox News affiliates for distorting the news. Instead, you found it in the form of a lawsuit against Fox News by the makers of the voting machines, where they accuse them of committing libel. So when it comes to social media platforms, content creators, and other forms of journalism that are not broadcast, that is where you might see some accountability, is through libel and slander lawsuits.
Now, over the summer, and I think a lot of people, I think this kind of went by a lot of people, but over the summer, Steve Wynn, the casino magnate, went to the Supreme Court and tried to get New York Times versus Sullivan repealed. Now, for those of you who don't know what New York Times versus Sullivan is, it's the Supreme Court case that says that if you are a public figure and you feel you have been libeled or slandered, you have to prove actual malice. You have to prove that not only did the person put out this false information about you, but that they meant to do it in a way that causes harm, that with malice, in order, to prevail. And what made that stand out for me is just, some of the stuff that we're seeing now kind of made me remember that, because if you tear down that particular Supreme Court decision, news distortion cases suddenly get a lot easier for people in power to go into court and attempt to prove, because they don't have the actual malice standard that they have to adhere to anymore. They can just say, oh, this is false. I can prove it's false. They meant to do this. And they don't have to worry about the increased standard of actual malice. So you're going to have a whole lot of politicians that say, well, you just said this about my policy because you don't like me, not because, not because your policy is bad, or not because you lied, or not because you did, something that was detrimental to the public, but just because you don't like me. And because I don't like what you said, I can sue and I can prevail. So, we talk a lot, there's a lot of moving pieces to the First Amendment. And I'm kind of sorry I didn't get to ask the New York Times versus Sullivan question of Professor Little, because I would have been interested in knowing what she's hearing about that, and, whether or not people are talking about the very real impact that the loss of New York Times versus Sullivan could have, particularly on people who do what we do, cover politics, because it governs political speech. And the people who would be most likely to sue, if, could you imagine, like, if some of the stuff that we report about the Parker administration, if New York Times versus Sullivan wasn't in place?
Yeah, it would be really difficult to do our jobs. What's interesting is that, like, one, libel laws are not federal laws; they're usually state laws. If you are a victim of libel, sometimes you will choose a state that is more favorable to your cause. Similarly, shield laws for journalists are also state laws. They are not federal laws. And in places like the UK and other parts of Europe, the burden of proof is on the media or the defendant in the case, to prove that they didn't do it deliberately. And so a lot of cases of libel are brought in the UK for international media companies because it removes the burden of proof from the plaintiff. Whereas here in the United States, if you bring a case forward, you have to have the evidence and prove that they did it with malice, which can be really difficult if you're not an employee at the organization. And I just want to read something here from the FCC, again, just showing how hard it is currently, because we know that there's a lot of news distortion going on at some stations, and they're not really held accountable. But it says the FCC will only investigate claims that include evidence showing that the broadcast news report was deliberately intended to mislead viewers or listeners. Evidence may include testimony from persons who have direct knowledge of an intentional falsification of the news, for example, written or oral instructions from station management, outtakes, or evidence bribery. Without such documented evidence, the FCC generally cannot intervene. The FCC does not investigate claims of collateral inaccuracy in news reports or differences of opinion over the truth or validity of aspects of a news program. While Jimmy Kimmel is not a news program, so these rules don't necessarily apply to that. However, the point that I want to make is, by the FCC's own words, they don't tend to investigate these cases unless there's a lot of evidence, and that evidentiary standard is very hard to meet.
So moving forward now, Jimmy Kimmel comes back, right? Do we think that there's going to be more of a crackdown by the Trump administration, or by virtue of Kimmel coming back, does that throw a little bit of cold water on that?
I think that if we use Project 2025 as a guide, we can absolutely expect more attempts to censor, intimidate, and defund media here in the United States. And the defunding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the investigations and the intimidation of NPR and PBS are all outlined in an entire chapter of Project 2025. So for people who are really shocked by this, I would say go and read Project 2025 to find out what might happen next. It is pretty clear that the authors of Project 2025, many of whom are in the Trump administration currently, and at the Heritage Foundation, believe that the quote unquote liberal media is the enemy. We also know that a major tool of this administration is the use of disinformation. We saw that yesterday with the announcement about Tylenol and autism. And Tylenol coming out today, and almost every major medical association also decrying that the link between autism and Tylenol as misinformation. That in order to further proliferate disinformation and to stop people from resisting, like students protesting on their campuses, that there is a need to infringe upon people's free speech rights. And we're also seeing many, many immigrants, including journalist Mario Guevara, who is still detained, their First Amendment right is being infringed upon. And so we're still in year one of this administration. And I anticipate that this is only the beginning of the attacks against the press and against people's rights to freely assemble, as we've seen in Los Angeles and Chicago, and also people's rights to freedom of speech.
And what we all need to remember is that when Vladimir Putin came into power in Russia, the first things he went after were the independent media. There were a couple of independent television stations that they had in Russia that, ironically enough, did parodies of the Putin administration. And Putin and his folks went to those stations and shut them down and told the journalists and the people doing content there that they could only get back in if they, swore a loyalty oath to them. So we really need, I mean, particularly with the example that you gave about the Pentagon, Larry, I tell people all the time, we really need to read Project 2025. It's almost Halloween. If you really want to look at something scary, I recommend that, because that is some frightening behind stuff.
So we're in this situation now as journalists, but not just journalists, everybody who's watching and listening, and we'll see this in subsequent clips in our newsletter. What are some of the things they should be doing, could be doing right now to protect their own First Amendment right?
Well, I think, for many people who attended Larry Krasner's town hall meetings last week, I know Denise was there and I watched on the live stream. One of the things that he discussed were people's First Amendment rights, right? What to do at protests, people's right to film the police, people's right to film ICE detentions. And so there's just a ton of information available online, especially from the ACLU, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, the Reporters Committee, and others. Free Press put out a guide at Know Your Rights about protesting. So educate yourself on what those First Amendment rights are. You can protest at City Hall. That is government property. I probably can't go onto your front porch though, Larry, and host a protest, right? Like that's not covered under the First Amendment. And so same thing with like businesses, right? You can protest on the sidewalk in front of a business, but you can't go inside to the business and protest. So there's a lot of things about that people should know. And I think it's also important for people to understand that these things are always changing. And so definitely following the hall monitor, following a lot of these organizations that work on free press. And I say that because a lot of these things are going to court, right? We're seeing things getting reversed, repealed, injunctions. And so especially locally here in Philadelphia, if there are lots of people arrested, follow those news stories, find out what happens to them. A lot of times people get arrested and the arrests are thrown out in court. They're dismissed. Sometimes they go to trial because they're trespassing or doing something else illegally. But I do think it's important to stay on top of this issue. And especially if you're a student, find out what your university's policies are. A lot of universities changed their policies this year as a result of the student protests. And I think what we're looking at with Karen Attiah, if you're an employee, read your employee manual and find out what the social media policies are. That is what's getting a lot of people in trouble. And in some cases, journalists and government workers, they're also banned from going to protests. So reread that employee manual, especially if you've been there a long time and you haven't read it in a while, and find out what the rules are so you don't get yourself in trouble.
And also use your money for the kind of media you want. Instead of handing that $1.50 over to some publication that isn't giving you the news you need, give it to Hall Monitor. Give it to independent media. You are not obligated to pay for anyone's fruit stand on the marketplace of ideas, but we would appreciate it if you gave some money to independent sources, because they're going to be necessary.
Right. And with that said, next week on this independent source, on this independent news program, we'll have Minority Leader Kendra Brooks with us. And we'll be talking more about this issue in the months to come. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Wait, before we leave, I just want to mention, visit our website, hallmonitor.org. We wrote a statement about defending free speech, and you can read it there, and you can subscribe for our newsletter there as well. But we think it's important to make a statement about that. And so you can read it in full on our website at hallmonitor.org.
All right, we'll see you next week.